Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. In May of this year, the killing of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor during a police raid on her home in Louisville, Kentucky, burst into the national news and became the subject of protest in the growing Black Lives Matter movement. Soon after, Yoruba Richin, head of the documentary program at CUNY's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, began working on a documentary about the incident. It delves into the background of the shooting, who the players were, and what actually happened that night, as opposed to the version of the story that originally circulated in the news. It also seeks to answer this question: has justice been served for Breonna Taylor? The Killing of Breonna Taylor was produced in cooperation with the New York Times and FX and is streaming on Hulu. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yoruba, the Breonna Taylor story has been covered extensively in the press, on television, on the internet. So why a documentary?
Well, interestingly enough, when we first started the film in June, basically early June, the Breonna Taylor, her situation and the tragedy that occurred was really only starting to gain momentum. She had been shot in March. And it took a while after the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd that her name became part of the litany for protesters, against police violence and state violence against Black people. So by the time June came around, the New York Times had done a couple of stories about the case, but there was really a lot of questions about what happened. What happened this night? Why was this young woman who was an essential worker in Louisville, Kentucky, who had no criminal record? Why was she shot in her own house? And we really wanted to find out what occurred as much as we can. What happened? What led to this tragedy? And but also tell the story of who Breonna was, what she meant to people. Why the city was in uprising because of her death, and really show, the multiple effects of her killing to her community, to her family, to her community, and to the city of Louisville, while also investigating as much as we can, as much as we could, what were the events that led up to that night and what happened that night.
How did you go about reporting the documentary? Where did you start and how did you proceed from there?
Well, one thing that was very important, the New York Times have a television show called The New York Times Presents. And they contacted me about, making this film. And of course, I immediately said yes. And when you're working with an entity such as the Times, there's a lot of resources that you can rely on, which was really helpful because this was a film that we did very quickly, in that we, wanted to get it out there as soon as possible. But in order to do that, we had to have the resources to be able to do that. And there was a lot that was unknown. So one of the first things that I did is I went to Louisville to meet with the family and talk with the family and the lawyers to secure their participation, as well as Kenny, her boyfriend, who was a survivor of that night. And also at the same time, an investigative reporter, Rukmini Calamachi, she was put on the case as well. And she started combing through the documents and through sources who could help us gauge what happened that night from the police perspective. We knew we had to tell, the story. There were different versions of events, and we had to tell both those versions. We also, a very important part of it too, was talking with the neighbors that night, who heard things, who were. The place where Breonna lived is a complex, so there are a lot of people around. And talking to those neighbors, gathering that cell phone video that a lot of neighbors took, because again, the police were not, even though eventually body cam footage was released, not by the officers who shot her, but by other officers that came on the scene. But the police at this point weren't releasing anything. So we really had to piece together from eyewitnesses of that night, um, audio from the officer who was shot by Kenny, because Kenny thought that somebody was breaking in their house. Audio of Kenny from that night, and then documents. So that's how we really reported this story.
How different was the original version that the public got about what happened how different was that version from what you found out had actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, the initial reports were, and we say this in the film, from friends and family, that there was a suspected drug dealing going on in the house, and that Kenny was shooting a cop, trying to shoot cops. That was the version that came out initially. That there was drug activity, and that there was Kenny was trying to shoot cops. There was no And first off, I just always have to say, even if there was drug activity in the house, that does not justify what happened to this woman. Even Pablo Escobar gets a trial. He's sitting right here in Brooklyn with a trial. You don't just go in and start shooting. But that was the narrative. And of course, no drugs or money were ever found in her apartment. So it makes it even all the more upsetting and appalling that this happened.
One thing you found was that in the original police report, it originally said, I think, there was no forced entry and no one was hurt.
Yeah, that was part of the stonewalling that the police, really how they conducted themselves throughout this entire process. This was in March that she was killed. And the results of the investigation were not released until early October. Police they did not, release any information. And yes, they came out with this report sometime in May saying that there were, no injuries and no forced entry. I mean, it was just more than a slap in the face to the families the family and the friends in the city that were waiting for, that were demanding answers.
So what were some of the things you found out from your reporting that you didn't already know about Breonna's story?
One of the things that we found out was we did discover more of a relationship that Breonna had with an ex who was a drug dealer. And they had, it was one of those off and on things that they had a relationship and entanglement. And that was, that's part of the story too. And it's what the police used to justify the warrants, the no-knock warrant in the first place. That's now under FBI investigation in terms of, was there enough reason? Because there's disputed facts about, if there was enough reason for them to be able to get a no-knock warrant. But I also learned all about no-knock warrants. I did not know about no-knock warrants, and that this thing existed where police can basically not announce themselves as they break into, before they, breach a door. And that, the whole thing around no-knock warrants is that you have a very militarized force coming to the door. And that's landed a lot of tragedies, not just with Breonna. And so I learned about that. And of course, one of the things that's happened is that the city has now banned no-knock warrants, and there is an effort to ban them, nationally. The other thing that we learned is that the neighbors did not hear police announce themselves. There's one neighbor who says he did, but we spoke to many neighbors who said they did not hear the police announce themselves. The police are saying that they did announce themselves. Kenny says that he didn't hear them. And of course, when the results of the investigation were released, David Cameron, the Attorney General, said in his, watched that press conference, and he said that it was a fact that the police did announce themselves because of this one neighbor, and ignored all the other neighbors who said that they didn't, at least 12.
One of the things that the documentary did for me was to really humanize Breonna Taylor and Kenneth Walker. Um, you hear his 9/11 call to the police. He's calling the police because somebody's trying to break in, he's trying to break in, busting down, and because has busted in, and Breonna has been shot.
Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend. Breathe, God. Hell.
And you really sense his terror and his sadness at the moment. You know, he thinks his girlfriend is dying and he really doesn't know what's going on there. You also interviewed him about his relationship with Breonna. What did you find out there?
So we were really happy that, Kenny decided to talk with us. It was the first long form interview that he did. And we felt it was so necessary, obviously as a survivor of this night, to have his perspective. We'd had those harrowing phone calls because they had been released, the 911 call that you had mentioned. But Kenny, he loved Breonna. They had been friends. The first thing he told me, he said, before we, start, she was my best friend. He said, they were, on and off through the years, but they always remained friends. These are young people. These are things, this is, how a lot of us, have these, relationships when we're young, and they, they take different, take on different meanings at different times in your life. And that's what he explained. But at this time, at this moment, when her killing happened, he said that they were really, they were on their way. They had made a commitment, renewed a commitment to each other. They were talking about having a family, and that things were the best that they'd ever been. And it was just obvious that he loved Breonna, loved her. And
you also learned a lot about her personality from her girlfriends.
Yes. So she was the kind of person who everyone looked up to.
She had a very inviting personality. She always had like a problem solver attitude.
She was a mentor to a lot of people. I mean, that's the thing, that I took away from this. It's not just the killing of Breonna Taylor, this 26-year-old woman. It's the killing of a daughter, a mentor, a girlfriend, a worker, an essential worker. She had a really bubbly personality. You can see that in the video, the social media video that we got of her. And people looked up to her. She was the kind of person that you would call when you needed support, when you needed encouragement. She was that kind of person. And everybody said that. And she always wanted to help people. She always wanted to be in the medical field.
I was also touched by the interview with Breonna's mother, and about how she was treated by the police. She found out that night or that early that morning that something had happened. She goes over to Breonna's house, but nobody will tell. I'm sure she identified herself as Breonna's mother. Nobody will tell her what's going on inside. In fact, the police never told her that her daughter had been shot. She had to find out that from the news.
No one never told me really what happened. I didn't find out that she was shot by a police officer till I saw it on the news.
That in and of itself should be, cause for, major disciplinary action. How she was treated. I mean, what can you say? It would be the most devastating. Can you imagine being told to go to the hospital, and while your daughter is, sitting there in the apartment shop, which is the first place that she went over, and then waiting in the hospital and then coming back? I mean, it's harrowing. It's harrowing. It's unacceptable.
Now, David James, who is the president of the Louisville Metro Council, a Black man and also a former police officer, emerges as one of the main voices that frame the film. What do you feel he contributed to the documentary?
Well, David James was really crucial, and so grateful for his participation. So he, first off, he's a former narcotics officer. So he can give us the perspective of that perspective. And what he did that was so important was tell us the proper way that this warrant should have been executed, that could have, that may not have resulted in that could have prevented her death. So that was very important. He also, as a Metro Council, which is like the city council, they were, following and demanding information from the police and could tell us, where the status was with the investigation, what were some of the complications. I mean, the other fact is that Kenny, when he thought he was being broken into, he fired one shot, and that police officer was shot, and then that was that prompted all the bullets being fired, and that's how Breonna was killed. But even though there is a stand your ground law in Kentucky, the police officers have a right to fire back, and that's why that's what they say, that the reason why that no officers were indicted. It's also more complicated because there's also legal law that says, you have to be in imminent danger, and were these other cops in imminent danger. So anywho, but David James was able to lay out some of those complications for us. And then also talk about the history of policing in Louisville, which was
right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Some of the other issues that were raised were that, I mean, as in a lot of towns, there was a lot of stop and frisk Black people, not necessarily for any good reason, that was going on, targeting Black residents. There were also, I believe, plans to redevelop the neighborhood West Louisville, and so they were trying to a big push to clean up the crime in that area, and there had also been the controversy over the use of no-knock search warrants. What surprised you most about what you learned in reporting this documentary?
Obviously, as an African American, we know that state violence and police violence is nothing new. It's nothing new. This has been happening to us in all kinds of ways, since we were brought here. What surprised me is, quite frankly, the brazenness of the police not answering when everybody was demanding answers, from the mayor to the Metro Council, and their brazenness in not answering any of those demands, not answering any of those questions it's really quite incredible. The continued anger of Louisville as well. Seeing how they were out there every night protesting, demanding answers, and keeping that up for months, for many months.
And if they had not done that, the
yeah,
case would not have gotten the national attention that it did, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's why, they kept her name alive. And initially when she was shot, it was the friends and family that were posting on social media. They were like, this narrative is all wrong, and we need to bring attention to this.
Since your documentary was put together, a number of things have happened. The Attorney General of the state announced that there would be no murder charges filed against any of the police. Only one officer, Brett Hankison, was charged with wanton endangerment, and that's because he just fired wildly, and some of the shots went into another apartment, other than Breonna's. What's your reaction to the Attorney General's report?
So as I said, I sat and watched that, his press release announcing the 2 charges that Hankison got, and no charges of murder for the other for any of the police officers, or even reckless endangerment for Breonna, shooting in her apartment. And what was shocking that that this version of events was being put out. As I said, he said that, it was clear that, that the police had announced themselves, ignoring Kenny and all the other witnesses who said that they hadn't announced themselves. That's obviously not clear. And so I had been prepared for the lack of that there was probably not going to be murder charges because of the complications of Kenny shot. So I had accepted that that was most likely going to be the case. But the fact that reckless endangerment was not even for her own apartment was really painful to see. And the investigation, and then now we found out since 2 grand jurors have spoken out and said that they were never even offered the charges to look at charges of the other officers. That he never, and Cameron said that we all agree, the way he said it is that the grand jury agreed and the grand jury was never offered those charges. Mm-hmm. And then there's a bigger issue of a grand jury system. And that's actually where I think a lot of this should be focused on, that there's a problem with a grand jury system that can indict, so-called criminals or, Black and brown people disproportionately, but can't bring charges to an officer who shot somebody in their home and let the jury decide. I mean, that's the whole point of the grand jury, right? And, there's a whole thing that I've now understood. Grand juries actually have a lot of power. They have powers to call witnesses. But they're not told these things. And so grand juries are often led by what the prosecutor, what the prosecutor wants. So there's a whole problem there. So the whole system is baked in to be, to let these officers off.
So from what you uncovered, and I posed this question earlier, do you feel that justice, well, there were 2 other things that happened. The city of Louisville agreed to pay a $12 million settlement to Breonna Taylor's family. And the Metro Council passed Breonna's law, which banned no-knock search warrants, and also now requires the police to turn on their body cameras during searches. So given that these things have happened, do you feel that justice has been done in the Breonna Taylor case?
No, not at all. That was the least that they should do. But justice obviously hasn't been done because no one is being held accountable.
Some months ago, we talked about the challenges of being a documentarian. And I was saying that there was a time when about the only place you could go, if you couldn't get onto PBS, there weren't many other places to go. But it seems like there are now more outlets, such as the New York Times documentary series, that so there are more outlets for documentarians. You agree?
We have definitely seen an explosion of documentary films and places that are showing documentary films. I mean, the streaming networks, the streaming places have, totally changed the game. When I started in this business about 25 years ago, the places, as you said, were PBS and then, HBO. And now you have all kinds of outlets looking for documentary films, news organizations, CNN, MSNBC, that have units dedicated to documentary films. There's such a need for content. And I think the other thing that has happened besides the technology shift is that news, I worked at ABC News from 2000 to 2004, and I really saw the shrinking of budgets for investigative units, for foreign units, for long form, what we call long form news, where you can really dive into a subject. It's not just a 3-minute, 2.5-minute news bite. And I think documentaries have really taken up a lot of that slack and a lot of that challenge. And then the audience, there's a demand for it from viewers. Viewers really like documentary films. Before, I think back in the day, they were kind of like eat your vegetables type things, but I think the creativity and the many different, perspectives and viewpoints that documentaries have, for the most part, are really appealing to the viewers.
What do you want viewers to take away from the film?
I want viewers to see who Breonna was and what, the meaning, what she meant to so many people. and to really understand that this is not just like, a meme, this is a person. And then I also want viewers to think about how the system is unjust, and what we can, and then think about what we can do about that to change that.
I certainly enjoyed the documentary. I recommend it to our viewers because I found it, I learned a lot from it. And as I said, what it really did for me was to humanize a lot of the characters that were involved. I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank Yoruba Richin, producer, director of the New York Times documentary, The Killing of Breonna Taylor, for joining me today. The film is now screening on Hulu. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.